sub-region, the West Africa Democracy Solidarity Network is urging the Independent National Electoral Commission of Nigeria to consider further expanding the deadline for the distribution of permanent voter cards, PVCs as they're called. On the 25th of February 2023, Nigeria would hold presidential and federal parliamentary elections with over 70 million people expected to cast their ballots in choosing the next leader for Africa's most populous nation. The West Africa Democracy Solidarity Network Group at a news conference explains that its pre-election field visit to the West African country reviews the deployment of logistics ahead of the polls is increasingly becoming a challenge for the INEC of Nigeria. But first, listen to our own former president, John Ajay Kufuor, expresses solidarity as Nigerians head to the polls.
I take myself as an old friend of Nigeria, and I've been privileged in the past to lead, I think, 1 or 2 observer teams to previous Nigerian elections. The one that comes to mind immediately is the one that brought the current sitting president, President Buhari, to office. I led the observer team, I believe from ECOWAS to that election, during which I interacted with the INEC, that time headed by Professor Jiga, and I met the entire team once or twice. I also met the candidates, including the then sitting president, President Goodluck Jonathan, and the main challenger, then General Buhari. I interacted with all of them before the election, and sat through also the entire process of the election. So I can claim to know a bit of this great nation, Nigeria. This time around, and with the opportunity given me now, I want to urge the current INEC to continue to be mindful of its responsibility and duty to the nation as a whole. The INEC is an institution of arbitration. It's like there to be neutral, to be responsible, and also to focus on its responsibility to help the people of Nigeria to go through the process in selecting the government they want, fairly and peacefully as possible. When the INEC would do its work this way, it would be contributing to ensure the continued stability of the nation of Nigeria. As we all know, Nigeria is the most populous nation on the continent of Africa. In West Africa, Nigeria alone, I believe, has more than 2/3 of the population of the entire West African area. And given its immense endowments, natural endowments, it's a leader nation. So whatever goes on in Nigeria impacts the rest of the region of West Africa.
Well, that impact is what we're about to have a conversation on. Joining me in studio is Alassane Bello. He, of course, understands the dynamics of the Nigerian politics going on there. Austin Aigwe is a member of the West Africa Democratic Solidarity Network, Nigeria, and also programs officer at Center for Democracy and Development, West Africa in Nigeria. He's also joining us via Zoom. Thank you, gentlemen, for joining us. Let me start off with you. Of course, since you are at the center of the action, Aigwe, as to whether or not, of course, in your view, you feel Nigeria is set for the general elections. What's your take on that, first of all?
Thanks for having me. Yes, Nigeria is set for election. We're pretty set for election. Everything points to the fact that elections will hold on the 25th of February for the national election and the 11th of March for the subnational election. That does not presuppose that there are no issues. There are countless number of issues. However, the election will go on as planned, and I believe that the commitment from INEC is enough to make this statement categorically. Having learned from other elections, particularly 2015 elections that the former president of Ghana talked about. The 2015 election, we were almost at the same point, even though we cannot truly say the same dynamics. There are some bits of differentials. However, there were security concerns, and that security concern continued to be a major concern as we head to this election. But the difference is also that in 2015, we didn't have enough time to plan for the election. I mean, unlike in Ghana, where you know the date of an election far ahead of time, so Nigeria just began that process where far back in February last year, we already knew when the election will hold. We already knew that the election was going to be February this year. So the plans have been on. INEC timetable for election is pretty sure concluded. I mean, just about 2 or 3 items now left on the timetable. So we are good to go.
Well, the West African Network of Civil Societies you belong to are raising concerns already about the deployment of logistics, non-ECU, and so either collection of PVCs and some other concerns which we'll talk about. But let's deal with the first two, which are critical to the success of the elections itself. What's happening with regard to, issues concerning the PVCs and the deployment of logistics?
So the logistical challenge raised is pretty with the scarcity with fuel. PMC is basically on short supply right now. So the WADEMOS is worried that if the scarcity continues to the election, it will impact negatively on the logistic deployment, because you need vehicles to move from one point to the other, to move material, electoral materials, ballot papers, ballot boxes, including personnel from one location to the other. So, but as of this morning, surprisingly, the queues are going down. The queues are going down. There was a high-level presidential committee in which the president sat in that committee to resolve the fuel challenge. Right now, I went around city today. Abuja, which really was literally flooded with queues on our filling station, has nosedived. That does not mean that the same thing is happening across the federation. That was a critical challenge that WADEMOS raised, and we hope that working with other stakeholders, INEC will be able to surmount that challenge, because it's not within the control of INEC. INEC does not supply fuel. INEC is not the NAPC that control fueling systems in Nigeria. On the second part with the PVC, there is a huge demand for people to collect young people, particularly young people who did the registration to vote, particularly in the last few months, the one that ended last year, about June, July. So that's where the demand is. So right now, INEC just printed the PVCs, and in the last month or so, the commission has asked people to come collect their PVCs, as it is usual with the kind of Africa tendency that people always want to wait till the last days. They then see an hurricane at those locations. But with WADEMOS' request, INEC has also extended the deadline. The deadline was supposed to be last Sunday. It's now been extended, which is also a good one. And Nigerians have been urged, particularly young people, who form the majority of registrants in
Okay.
this election to go with their PVC.
The elephant in the room now is about peace and security. Security challenges threatening the peaceful running of the elections itself. How's that playing out?
It does have a challenge. It is a huge challenge. Like I said, in 2015, it was a challenge, even though the dynamics has changed. In 2015, the area that was a bit of a challenge was the Northeast. Before now, I heard someone talking about insurgency control in Ghana. So part of what happened in 2015 was the military deployment that went ahead, and then eventually they were able to dismantle the architecture of the insurgents, and then election took place in that area. But right now we have a bigger challenge because we are no longer talking about just Northeast. We're not talking about the Northwest, we're talking about North Central, we're talking about Southeast. In fact, technically, every part of Nigeria has a kind of challenge, a kind of security challenge that may impact on the election. However, and that's where the good news comes in, our constitution does not restrict that a certain number of voters must turn out to give legitimacy to an election. So what it will mean is that we have had previous obstacle election in the state of, in Anambra State, in the southeast, particularly area that is largely dominated by unknown gunmen. You would have heard of unknown gunmen, areas where people are agitating for a separation of states, a secessionist movement. In that area, there's one state called Anambra. Election took place there, and only 10% of the registered voters turned out to vote, and the results was declared. And in that state, there's a sitting governor who is administering the state of affairs. So, but we don't wish that we have a low record of voter turnout. We wish that there'll be an increased level of voter turnout to determine the choice of Nigeria, because Nigeria, the outcome of this election has a huge role to play for other African countries.
Yes, and we'll talk about that shortly, about the impact on the West Africa sub-region. Alassane Bello is also with us. He understands the dynamics of the security implications, and I mean the security developments there in Nigeria. So with what's happening now, is it your view that Nigeria will be able to overcome the security threats and hold a peaceful elections? So just break it down for us.
Sure, I think Nigeria stands to do very well. If you look at 2015, as you said,
okay,
it was just limited to a certain geographical portion. But even the fight at that point in time was not just carried out by the Nigerian troops. Right. It was this multinational joint task force that comprises of Nigeria, Cameroon, you have Chad, and you have Niger. Those were the other countries that rendered assistance to the Nigerian government. So whilst the Nigerian army were doing the push from the Nigerian territory, by then you had those countries sealing off the border. Mind you, the West African borders are very, very porous. So they had to seal off the border. And we saw within a month, Nigerian army recapturing places that were outside state control, I think, for about 6 years or so. But then if you look at the fact that despite all the chaos in the country is relatively stable to a certain extent. That is a plus to the Nigerian Security Agency. And if you look at the size of the country, they are virtually outstretched. Because if you have the military operating in, I think, about 15 or more states, doing internal security operations, which is actually a domain of the police force, that should tell you the magnitude of the problem. But it should also tell you that whilst there's a lack of capacity within the police, the army as a complementary, component of the security architecture, as you call it, done well. So Nigeria has that capacity to conduct an election and then come out stronger. But the only problem we have is now that the security challenges is spreading. And the locus is quite different. When you go to the Northeast, it is being carried out within the context of an Islamic insurgency. Right. When you come to the Southeast,
the secessionists,
where we have the Biafran agitation. When you go to Niger Delta area, it is more about resource control. And when you come to the Southwest, it's more about kidnapping and other crimes. So then the question is, how do you respond to this agitation? Because you cannot have a definite military solution to all. There must be dialogue. So
the web is more complex now.
It's more complex now. But the question is, who do you talk to? How do you address the situation? Because like he said, 10% legally could give you a legitimacy. But then it could also undermine your legitimacy, your credibility. Because the question is, whether the people, those who abstain from the election, did they really abstain out of genuine security, situation, or they were just out of the lack of alternative where they felt that dissolution from the system. They decided not to vote. So you need to weigh the two. So how do you identify the problem? If it's about out of dissolution with the system, then there's a bigger problem.
The INEC of Nigeria, came up with the initial idea of postponing the elections. Then the chairperson came back to say, well, I feel we're set, we can still go ahead with the elections. The February 25 timeline, does that sit down well with you, looking at the complex nature of the security situation in Nigeria?
Well, I'm sure as an insider, he knows more than we do. So for him to have given us assurance that it could be held on the 25th of February, I think is first of all something we should work with. And likewise, if you realize that the 2015 election was postponed, but people thought it was an insurmountable challenge, very difficult to do. But then we saw smooth running of the election. So the EC has a track record that can be relied upon to give them the benefit of the doubt. So let's see what happens come 25th of December.
But the issue of security, insurgency in itself, could become a political tool that could either play in for whichever political party is seeking to, of course, win the next elections. What are the key concerns in terms of security that will play out? A reason for which the political parties, many will be expecting that they would formulate policies around that.
Well, if you look at the narrative of the ruling party, it's like they have improved security in the Northeast, which is a fact. The security in the Northeast has improved. Boko Haram is no more in control of a large swathe of the country. But then for whatever plans they have in that part of the country, you have an Achilles heels across the other part of the country. So how do you juxtapose that? Another thing we need to look at, if you look at successive opinion polls, right, Peter Obi seems to be leading on the polls, even though you have a huge undecided voter population. But then Peter Obi actually rely on the Southeast
base
as a stronghold. And that used to be, that also happens to be PDP stronghold in the 2015 general election. And then, there's this Monday sit-in where the militant prevent people from going out on Mondays just to show their presence, kind of demonstration of their power. So the question is, if the insecurity causes a low voter turnout, won't it impact on the fortunes of the candidates? And then insecurity in the Northeast will impact negatively on the fortunes of Peter Obi. Despite the fact that he's leading per the opinion polls. Right. And mind you, in Nigeria, precisely, the North has always enjoyed more voter turnout than any other part of the country.
Interesting dynamics there, Alassane Bello with his perspective on that. But Austin, and that's where I want to bring you in as to how this electoral exercise will be inclusive. Alassane has just pointed out the complex security situation in Nigeria. That may deter more and more people from coming out and participating in the elections itself. So in your view, would that not affect the quality of what's supposed to be a democratic exercise?
Yes, it probably does have an implication in terms of inclusivity, but not to hold the election is worse off. So can we then say because of insecurity, we just allow the current regime to state their constitutional timeline? Of course, no. There won't be a constitutional challenge because the current regime administration must, as of law or constitutionality, hand over to a next president on the 29th of May this year. So election is supposed to hold in February so that there's enough time to have maybe legal issues and all that before handing over. So the question about security, like Alassane said, yes, you see, that's why I said just now that we have challenge across the length and breadth. There are other undiscussed issues. Right now there's a huge poverty rate in Nigeria. Poverty itself is built conflict. That's on one side. So while the Northeast is gradually or has gradually reduced, there's a security situation that is beyond anyone's explanation in the Northwest, talking about states of Kano. And the Northwest actually has the highest number of registered voters. They determine who become president of Nigeria because of their huge number of votes. However, Peter Obi winning Southeast alone is very inconsequential. It has the least number of registered voters. The poll that San referred to is not a Southeast poll, it's a Nigerian poll, which means somehow is accepted across beyond the southeast area. If it does rely on southeast only, because that's where it comes from, is from the southeast, actually it's not going to make any big deal. The same way in the northeast, the candidate of the PDP, Atiku Abubakar, is from northeast where you have supposedly the reduced insurgency situation in that area. The candidate of the ruling party is from Lagos State, where the southwest state. And the southwest, across the country, we have situation of kidnapping. It was in the northwest. We had, maybe you heard where a moving train was attacked and folks on board were kidnapped. And it's just like but there's a way Nigeria situation happened. You know, they will say Nigeria happened to you. That while we are discussing security, election will just come and go. People were wondering, how did it happen? It just happened. The important thing is that February 25th, 2023, Nigerians will go to poll. Election may not. I want to be quoted correctly. Election may not hold in any area that is hard to deploy materials and personnel. You are sure that INEC won't move there. INEC will not want to risk. INEC will want to risk their personnel. They probably want to conduct election elsewhere because there's also a threshold in a way that for a winner to be declared in an election in Nigeria, there are certain thresholds the winner must meet. So if, for example, election takes place and there are 36 states of the
Austin? Austin, are you with us? Okay, we've lost Austin there, but I was just about flowing into the flashpoints that we need to be on the lookout for. Bello, for you, which areas will the Nigerian authorities be focused on in terms of the flashpoints trying to curb or perhaps de-escalate tension ahead of this crucial exercise at the end of February?
Well, I think the situation is very fluid and widespread, so they should be able to deploy fast across. But first of all, let me correct something.
Right.
The opinion poll I was referring to, I wasn't referring to it as a Northeast opinion poll.
Right.
What I'm saying is the opinion polls have given Obi the lead successively. But then every politician has his own stronghold where he's supposed to earn certain number of votes to give him a kind of leverage. So if the East happens to be a stronghold and the threshold over there is very, very low, no matter how many he makes in the other side, there could be a problem. And moreover, the election is supposed to be a two-man race between the ruling party and the opposition PDP. All of a sudden, the personality of Obi and his message resonated, right? But then there's another person we are not looking at. He made mention of the Northwest being the vote, a very important, entity, part of the continuous election, because they have a huge voter turnout, right? But then, mind you, there's another candidate from Kano State, Rabiu Kwankwaso, who's a former governor and former minister of defense. He's running. So put it into context, PDP or Peter Obi's stronghold is in the, southeast. APC in the previous election did well in the northwest, but then you have another contender coming from Kano State, who might one way or the other dilute the vote of the PDP, of the ruling party APC. That's why people are saying that it was supposed to be a two-man race. But then the personality of Obi have made it a three-man race. But need to look at the impact of Peter Obi. But the security-wise, I think the focus should not really be on So now we should look at the northwest, because you have bandits roaming around. And moreover, elections will be undermined mostly in the rural areas. Because if you look at banditry in Zamfara State, Kaduna State, Kano State has cited, they are more prone in the rural areas than the urban areas. But the problem is now is that, what about the IDPs who have been displaced from their due to insecurity? How do you include them in this whole process?
But by and large, I'm sure that you're predicting that there will be a peaceful process.
Sure, and we hope it is. And then looking at the previous election, despite the security challenge, Nigeria did well. So we hope they will replicate the same success and then.
Alison, Bello, thank you for joining us here on The Pulse.